And so what we're seeing is that they're doing anything to prevent people from voting, but they're doing anything but in very specific places. They're not doing this across the whole states. They're doing this in districts, in cities, in states that are majority either black and brown or minority.
States that have suppressed and disenfranchised black votes throughout their entire existence. There's still redistricting happening in some of these states where they're literally just drawing lines around black people and people of color. Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast.
We're your hosts. I'm Dee Barbadillo.
And I'm Amir Whitaker.
As always, we keep you all informed with various interviews and discussions that are really important to our communities. Today, we're talking about the voter suppression of black and brown voters.
Yes, and that's something that's always been in place in this country from the very beginning of its founding, when voting was something exclusively reserved for white men who owned property. And as the 1800s came around and slavery, we fought to end slavery and different amendments were passed, there was still resistance. And then now today in 2024, an election year, we're actually seeing some of the most resistance we've seen in years with what's at stake. So after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment, in 1868, black Americans faced systematic barriers to voting. And it took the 15th Amendment, actually, in 1870 to protect black men's right to vote. And we know at that time, women just weren't even considered.
Not even on the playing field.
For democracy at all, right?
Right.
It wouldn't be until the 20th century when that would happen. But Southern states immediately enacted strategies, laws, policies, terrorism. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan actually was formed as a voter suppression tool, a terrorist arm of voter suppression, because those white men with hoods would burn crosses on people, on property and different things. And the main form of intimidation they were intending was to not allow black men to exercise their right to votes, actually. So a lot of the lynching and different things. But to think that a terrorist organization was started to suppress votes shows how embedded it is in the system. But all throughout the South, you saw these movements to resist that, marches to Selma, all over to get to this Voting Rights Act in 1965. And I know I kind of skipped 100 years really quick, right? Because there were lots of things from race riots to they're martyrs, people who died, black people died for us to have the right to vote in this country. So I don't want to dismiss or diminish the sacrifices they did. But now, 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed, and we have some different cases and different things that have also touched on this topic since then. But where are we now? What's going on now?
So the Voting Rights Act was meant to remedy historical discrimination. There's certain clauses in the Voting Rights Act that said you states were not giving the rights to black voters, and not just not giving them the rights, but actively trying to prevent them from voting. So there were some clauses in the original Voting Rights Act that said, if you try to enact any new rules, any new barriers, any new parameters for voters, you need to run it by this particular panel, because historically you have not done well doing that.
Right, they created things like literacy tests and other things.
And so there was a panel of folks that needed to okay any small change that needed to be happening.
Redistricting
and what was unique about it was that they said, historically, you've done this incorrectly, so now we're going to watch you in particular. So it's one of the rare cases where you see a law that is particular to remedying past crimes. We're going to call it a crime. But in 2013, there's this particular case. It's called Shelby County v. Holder. There's a lot of legalese in there, but basically they were appealing the idea that certain states would have to be checked based on their historical record. They said it wasn't fair that these states were being treated differently from the other states.
Right.
So what happened was actually they threw out those provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the very important
ones
provisions.
that people marched for, fought for.
So yes, you have the right to vote, but now the assurances that there wouldn't be any voter suppression have been taken away. And so what happened was they said that, well, federalism says that states can't be treated differently. But ironically, in using that argument, now these states have free reign to treat voters differently.
Right.
And so that's what we're seeing.
And there's no oversight with states that have suppressed and disenfranchised black votes throughout their entire existence. There's still redistricting happening in some of these states where they're literally just drawing lines around black people and people of color to ensure that they have as little as power when it comes to whether it's in Congress in Washington or in the state representatives or even on their local school board. You'll see the redistricting happening and the voter disenfranchisement. I remember when I was in Florida, actually, the way voters are registered there, it's connected to your driver's license. And I saw some statistic where I was in Miami where it was like just half of young black men had their driver's license because, for example, my license was suspended before I was even eligible to get it because of the charge I caught as a 15-year-old, even though I hadn't been behind the wheel.
Right.
So in Florida, what this translates to is young black men being disenfranchised. Many of them don't have their license for different reasons. So their voter eligibility is impacted by that too. Their ability to serve on a jury is impacted by that too. And that's another form of not having your full citizenship.
Right. And I'm seeing now as I read the news that the voter suppression tactics range from outwardly racist to silly and petty. For example, in Georgia, they tried to say that if there's a line of over 150 people, that you can't give them water and food while they wait. Like that was an actual argument to prevent folks from aiding people who are willing to wait in line to vote. And I think what ended up happening was that was struck down as if people want to give food and people want to, give them water, that's their First Amendment right to do so. But you're seeing the range from that to, hey, if you don't write the correct date on the outside of your envelope, you're now not allowed to vote. And so what we're seeing is that they're doing anything to prevent people from voting, but they're doing anything but in very specific places. They're not doing this across the whole states. They're doing this in districts, in cities, in states that are majority either black and brown or minority. It's very specific, very targeted. And this is what happened because of that Supreme Court decision. I think there's this idea that, you can't have a law that targets putting more minority voters or more of minority elected officials, but that's not actually what the law was about. The point of the Voting Rights Act was to not allow voter suppression to become law. But by taking that away, now you're saying the law allows me to do whatever I want to get those votes and to prevent people from voting. And so in many ways, the Voting Rights Act that people fought so hard for, the history you were talking about, it's really sad to see that it's just fallen by the wayside.
So it's so anti-democratic, this democracy. When you look at other countries and their voting process, whether they have days off because people vote to vote, or whether they have, I believe it's China where incarcerated people actually vote inside the facilities. Whereas here, that can be taken away depending on your state and different things. But our democracy isn't that rich because we truly don't encourage voter participation, and they're trying disenfranchisements. They're using so many different strategies. I saw now with the invention of AI, they're using AI to purge voter rolls to see if someone, for example, maybe has two addresses across two different counties, and one could be just an older address they lived at years ago. They're using that to say, you're trying to register to vote in two counties, so they remove them from their latest county. In
the past few election cycles, what you saw were communities of color coming out in droves. We saw historic numbers for communities of color voting and showing up. You saw people waiting in line for hours. And I think when people realized that people were not taking the right to vote for granted, that's when you're seeing all these tactics by those in power to prevent voters from exercising their right. And it's just a shame because this is such a basic right. This is such a basic thing. And this is what those in power are spending their time trying to prevent from happening.
And it's democracy. I think that's really important.
In this quote-unquote democracy, right.
Because that is the definition of a democracy, where
Right.
people have the ability to participate and elect their leaders and officials.
Yeah.
But this government and different governments, whether it's the city, county, I've seen it at the school board where they're trying to suppress participation. But there's so many measures that happen to limit participation in democracy.
And we're seeing new age tactics, like you said, whether it's AI or just coming up with simple rules that are hard to follow or easy to not follow. But I think what's important is when people get bogged down in all the details is that at the end of the day, we should be making it easier for folks to vote, not harder. And you shouldn't be able to invalidate a voter just because they made a clerical error or just because they did something that doesn't actually affect who they are as a citizen, who they are as a voter. And so it gets complicated. There's so many fights going on in different states. But at the end of the day, it's as simple as if people want to vote, they should be able to vote, and they shouldn't be manipulated in any way.
Right.
Right.
When you turn on the TV, it's so easy to vote on like American Idol and
Right,
all these other
yeah.
things, just shoot a text message and different things. And clearly we need more security and different things to show,
Right.
but there are different creative things that could be done to allow for participation. And
Right.
unfortunately, politicians and others are doing the complete opposite.
Yeah. In fact, I invite folks to look at district maps because there's no rhyme or reason. They look like a young
Yeah.
child scribbled on a piece of
Yeah.
paper in two different colors. And you'll see how ridiculous it is and the lengths people are going to in order to suppress votes.
Yeah, like I've seen district maps where I'm trying to think of how to explain this, but like if they know black people are here in the YOR and the white people are here, they'll literally draw the map around them
Yeah.
just to ensure that they have enough white votes, and they'll make this a separate district or
Yeah.
reduce the size. But
Yeah.
these gerrymandering things, which
Yeah.
have been documented for decades, and that's why the Voting Rights Act protections should exist, because these states have a long history of doing this.
And it's also sad to see that there was progress made in trying to right a historical wrong. But what we've decided is that there's no point in that.
So I've actually been registered to vote in now 4 states, because I've lived in 4 states. And one of those states, my home state of Jersey, I actually worked as a poll worker. My grandmama had me working since I was 18 years
Yeah.
old on the polls, as she would say. We get a little $100 a day, 10-hour day. We will open the polls, close the polls down, and different things.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see how democracy worked in Jersey compared to Florida. Oh, my Lord, where I went to law school. It was so hard to vote, and there you would see these long lines and different things. The mail-in ballots, they would try to find different excuses. In Alabama, I was surprised to see how bad it was too.
Wow.
And they make it so difficult. And then now in California, where we both live, it's so easy with the mail-in ballots and just different things.
Yeah.
It's just interesting
Yeah.
to see how democracy works in different places where you can tell where they want you to vote
Yeah.
and where they don't want you to vote.
Yeah, and those, again, speaking of mail-in ballots, those are the tactics. Like we talked about the petty ones, where it's clerical errors, but what they're trying to do is prevent early voting,
Right.
preventing mail-in ballots. They're trying to invalidate people who generally they see the history of people only voting by mail. So these are targeted. They're trying to make it as difficult as possible, and we're lucky to come from a state where it's pretty easy to vote. But to not be able to do that is sort of hard
Right.
to fathom.
It was culture shock for me how easy it was to vote in California.
bet,
It shouldn't be
yeah.
culture shock just to participate in the democracy.
Right,
You know?
right. And again, I think this just goes to paying attention. If you're seeing that suddenly the way to vote or the rules for voting in your area have become a little bit harder, pay attention to who you think might be behind that. And that gives you perhaps an indication of who you should or shouldn't be supporting. I think it's just sort of go back to the source, and that could be something that you could take away from this as well. And that at the end of the day, again, it's almost too simple. Voting should be easy. If this is the democracy that we say it is, then make voting easy. And if it's not, then let's not fuss around with this and let's figure out what we really are, which is not quite a democracy.
Right.
Yeah. Get ready for a wild ride. We have a lot more episodes to come. In the meantime, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channels and follow us on social media at Your Rights Camp.